This child is not an English language learner. You're going to have the ability to have a process now to actually declassify that child, as well as classify a child. So let's say that I come into your district, you say, well, she's not an English language learner. In a few weeks, the teacher's like, Angelica's definitely an English language learner. Now you can classify me. So it goes both ways. There's some wiggle room in how you do this. Okay, so this is something that's new. So it'll give us the ability to, so this young man doesn't have to keep sending me pictures of his son with an American flag, so that we can say, okay, this child is not an L. However, just because parents pressure you doesn't mean that that's the answer. The child has been in the program for 2 years and has not been able to test out. Does not mean that his child is not an L. That he would like his child to be an L, that's a different conversation. Right? All right, so let's look at next thing. So maintain records. That shouldn't be new. It's important, especially when we go from district to district. I give this example. There's a district right now, so some kids went from New York City to another district. The school did not send the records in a timely fashion, as happens sometimes, right? So what happened? The district administered the lab R again. At the time, I'm saying lab R because that's what it was called last year when it happened. The NICETEL. You're not supposed to administer that test more than once. It's for identification and placement only. So now these kids have received services for a year. They were English language learners, and they took this test. What do you think happened? They tested out, right? So the kids struggled all year. The parent came back, called the Attorney General's office, our office, and said, my kids are English language learners. I told them at the district, they didn't believe me, and now, what do you think is happening now? Guess where those kids are now? Private school. Guess who's paying for it? The district. Okay? So, records and identification, and we're going to have a timeline and how that has to be administered throughout the state. There was going to be a big data system, but it is not. I mean, it's not happening now. That's what kind of Bloom was going to do. Since that is not on the table anymore, we are creating more of a manual system that we can have some of that data. But we're hoping to be able to share that data with you. We're contracting a company so that you can have access to any of the data from New York State. So if this child comes to you from Syracuse, you can say, okay, let's look up this child. This child comes from Syracuse. The child was administered the NICETEL. Okay, so you have that information. Okay, so I don't have to go over this one because I'm sure that everybody already here does it, that you send information home in a language that parents understand. That's not even part of Part 154, it's Part 100, it's part of almost every regulation. That's something that you need to do. It's also how you communicate with parents. How do you communicate with them in a language that they understand, right? Because then what's the point? Okay, this one is new. So we had already that you were supposed to meet with parents of English language learners to talk about the curriculum. Aside from any other session, you were supposed to be talking to them about the curriculum, the standards, so you're supposed to bring them in. So now what we're saying is that you bring them in, or you have a conversation with them, or you communicate with them, hear my language, right? To talk about their English language development. Does that make sense? Parents don't know. Parents are shocked. And you know, now they get the letter with the nicest lab. They don't understand what that means. And how is my child doing in chemistry? How is their English developing in chemistry? Is it their English? Is it the chemistry? What's happened? But that goes back to number one, right? All teachers are teachers of English language learners. Are your teachers equipped to have that conversation? Okay, so here is where you want to have this discussion. So who can tell me, are bilingual programs new for the state of New York?
No.
What is the default program currently, not September, for ELS? What is it? Come on. I heard something over here and I'm hearing something else over here. Bilingual program is the default program for the state of New York. So when I got a lot of these questions, like how are we supposed to start these bilingual programs? Guess what? You were supposed to have them already, right? So the default program is bilingual education. That is the program that's supposed to be. We should have been monitoring for it. So now how does that change? So you have 10 days, and I want to be very clear about this because there was a misunderstanding in certain districts. You have 10 days to place the students in the appropriate program. Not 10 days to register them. Are we clear? We know the difference? Child comes in, you register them immediately, and then you have 10 school days to place them in the appropriate program. Because we went to a district where they sent the kids home and they said, well, we have 10 days. No, 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 no. That is not the case. You have 10 days to place them in either an ESOL and an ENL program or in a bilingual program. That is what that's about. Okay? So identification process, student receives the final placement. So that's all there. I'm not going to go through it. How much time do I have? Because I want to answer all your questions. I'm going to try to finish in the next 5 minutes, tell you what's new. Is any of this new that I'm telling you? Probably not, right? Okay, so I'm going to rush through it. Okay, so English as a new language instruction. Integrated ENL, right, /ESL. This is what we want to talk about, right? Okay, so let's talk a little bit about that in a few minutes. I'm going to go through that, go through the other ones, and come back to that, because then we're going to spend time around that. What that looks like, what the minutes are, and all of that. Okay, so now we have the 20 or more that you were talking about, students that speak the same language. We have it on a grade. So what does that look like? We changed it a little. And also, now the only difference is by district. So it's not just by school, now it's by district. So if you have those kids, 20 or more, throughout your district, you're supposed to create a program. Couple of things. I usually start this presentation, which is much longer, talking about the subgroups. Who knows what the L subgroups are? We already discussed one. Psych. Good group. What else? Long-term. Long-term Ls. Could somebody define long-term Ls? More than 6 years, right? After they finish their 6 years, starting their 7th year of service. What do we know about those kids? What do we know? Those are our lowest performing kids. They're the ones that do the worst in our system. And what do we know about them too? Most of them speak English, right? That's the kid that you're like, I don't even understand why this child is an L. Most of them were what? Where were they born? Born here. Born here. Most of them have been with us since kindergarten. So when I talk about long-term Ls, I think about that as our failure. But what do we know about those kids too? More than half of them what? Have an IEP, right? And I'll tell you why that's important for us, because with the new regulation, it's going to change the landscape of what that looks like. Okay? I tell this story very quickly. My son has an IEP. My son is autistic. When I come into the school system, if I didn't know that my son had a disability, he would come in. In my house, we speak to him in Spanish. I only speak to my kids in Spanish. My husband speaks in English. My kids, he went to a dual language program, which was 90-10, 90 meaning 90% Spanish, 10% English. My babysitter speaks English. My mother speaks Spanish. Was with them 2 days a week. So what is my child? Bilingual. Is he an L? I didn't know until we walked into the school, right? So when we walked in, I was panicking because I was like, oh my gosh, he could be an L. What did I do? Blah, 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 blah. The panic sets in. And I decided to stay outside and let my husband, while they administer the home language, it was across the board, Spanish and English. But now he gets this test. And those of you that have seen the old lab R, because he's in first grade now, you know what that test was like, right? The bus is orange. I mean, I don't know what school bus is orange. But anyway, so he, he takes this test and he passed. Because I was like, oh, maybe he should be an L. I was like, okay, whatever. He doesn't know what I'm talking about. But the point is that at that moment, it was very real. He passed the test. But what I thought about at that moment is his disability is not going to allow him to demonstrate that he's truly bilingual, right? So that was nerve-wracking for me at that moment. So it changes the way you look at things. So what happens to families especially immigrant families, that may not know that their child has a disability. What does that look like? And a lot of them don't. It's not something in the immigrant community that anyone talks about. In other communities, people advocate. In the immigrant community, nobody wants to talk about it. Those kids don't go out, they don't see family members. Those are the kids that never leave the house. It's a reality in the community. Especially if you're talking about Asian communities, where they're supposed to be high performing and succeeding. So there's a whole host of things that happen with the immigrant community. So now what happens? So we have those students with disability, we have long-term Ls, more than half of them are. With the new regulation, we will be able to have a different way to actually exit those kids. Okay, and I'll talk to you when I talk to you about Part 154-3. So we have, what do we have? Psych, long-term Ls, students with a disability that are Ls. There's newcomers, 0 to 3 years, right? It's important to talk about that when we talk about these programs, because we have all those categories. So let's think about it. You have a new arrival who comes in. How are you placing these kids? And I know there's a couple of things that I know you're uncomfortable about. I can tell you what they are right away. Those 2 years, don't group them by 2 years. I know that that's a problem, right? So let's think about it. So now I have a SIFE. Lisette, raise your hand. Lisette's our SIFE student, right? She is our long-term L, was born here. You have a disability. Listen, at this point, I'm convinced I have ADD. Right? So, and then I'm the new arrival. I just got here. I can read and write in Spanish. I can't read and write in English. Guess what? We group them all in one class, except for maybe the student with a disability. We're all in one class because we're all beginners. Really? Or we happen to be intermediate. Let's make it more interesting. We're all intermediate. I'm not going to say anything else about that. Think about it instructionally. Also, what are we teaching? So I went to a school in, actually I'm not going to mention the district, upstate. They had 9th, 10th, 11th, and 12th graders together. I said, okay. They said they're all intermediate. And then we went through the line. Okay, these 7 were born here. These are new. They've only been here 12 months. And these are sight. They're all intermediate. Obviously, they all have the same needs because they're all intermediate. And what are you doing in terms of language? There has to be some content instruction. Like, what are you doing? So what are you giving them that you think it's okay to have them all these grade levels together? Something to just think about, okay? As we discuss that. Okay, keep going, he said. Oh, the bilingual programs. Other than Spanish and Chinese, you can apply for a waiver. How many of you have other languages other than Spanish and Chinese? Okay. So you can apply for this waiver so you don't have to have the bilingual programs. For a year, and you may have to apply again. It depends on what is happening. So what are some of the things that are happening in your district? Can you find the teachers? In many languages we cannot find the teachers. We have trouble finding them in some more common languages. Okay. I keep forgetting I have this thing here. Okay. So we talked about the maximum grade level, the bilingual programs. If you have bilingual programs in elementary school, you should have them in middle school, in high school, continuity of services. So what I wanted to say about the long-term Ls, there was a study done. Long-term Ls are students that experience a break or inconsistent schooling. How many of you have kids that are here with you 4 years and then go back to their home country and come back 2 years later? Those are your potential long-term Ls. That doesn't mean they're not going back.